All right, in this short demo, we're going to walk you through the OpenVaccine Notebook. We're going to start by enabling the Kaggle Jupyter Lab extension. We'll then explore the various cells within the notebook, and then ultimately we'll deploy a pipeline. Okay, let's do this. The first thing to do is to navigate over to the sidebar of the Jupyter Labs interface and enable the Kaggle Jupyter Lab extension by just hitting that toggle switch, and that's going to make it a little bit easier for us to navigate the notebook as far as seeing what's happening within the cell, but also what dependencies, inputs, and outputs are also happening. Okay, let's move to the first section of the notebook, which is going to be where we're going to install our necessary packages. Now, we can install the necessary packages by running pip install user package name, or we can include everything in a requirements.txt file and just run pip install user-r requirements.txt. Now, you do want to note that we're going to be using the user argument because we want Kaggle to transform this notebook into a Kubeflow pipeline. Next, let's move to the import section of the notebook, and here's where we're going to import our libraries and our dependencies. You can see we're using JSON, which is going to be an encoder and decoder, NumPy to provide math functions, algebra, and number generators, Pandas, which is a data analysis library, TensorFlow, which is a collection of workflows to develop and train models using Python or JavaScript, as well as a pre-processing text component, which is going to help us do some tokenization. All right, let's move on to the next section, which is going to be the project hyper parameters. And in this section, we're going to have our definitions of our hyperparameters, as the name would imply. Things like epochs, things like dropouts, things like batch sizes, etc. In this section, you'll also find a specification for random seed plus to ignore warning messages. This takes us into our next section of the notebook, which is going to be the load and preprocess data section. So specifically in the load data section, we want to understand that our data is coming in a JSON format. So we want to use the read JSON pandas method. There's going to be one training data set and at least two test data sets. One is going to be public, one is going to be private. And then we're going to load the sample submission.csv file. And this is what you can use for your submission if you choose to for the Kaggle competition. Also, the pandas head method is going to help us visualize a small sample set of the data. Moving right along to the pre-processing data section. So here we define the symbols that are going to encode certain features and target variables. We're also going to encode values and feed them to the neural network by tokenizing them. And this tokenizer is going to keep a dictionary called word_index from which we can get the number of elements in our vocabulary. Further down in the pre-processing data section, we'll see that we've got some work here where we're going to be transforming each character sequence into number sequences and then concatenating them together. We'll be looking for a particular shape, plus we'll be doing some additional pre-processing. Now let's go ahead and move on to defining and training the model. So here we're going to define our model with sequences. We'll use some bidirectional GRUs as well as some LSTMs. The output layer should produce 5 numbers, so we can see this as a regression problem. And then we'll define 2 helper functions for the GRUs as well as the LSTMs, and then we'll define the body of the full model. With some additional functionality happening in this particular step, which we covered previously in the slides, we're now ready to move to the evaluate the model step. Now, in this particular step, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to evaluate the model using the 2 test data sets that we talked about earlier. And this leads us to our final step, which is going to be the submission step. So this is going to create a submission for the Kaggle competition, and the submission is just going to be in a CSV format with the necessary columns contained within it. All right, with the quick walkthrough of the notebook completed, we're ready to go ahead and submit this as a pipeline. And it's really easy to do. We've already got the Kaggle Jupyter Lab extension widget enabled, so we can just go to the bottom of the widget, click on the compile and run button. And here a couple of things are going to happen for us automagically because we're using the Kaggle Jupyter Lab extension. One, the notebook is going to be validated, and then we're going to be taking a snapshot of the notebook, the data, the environment. So if we want to reconstitute it at a later date, we can do so precisely to this specific state. And then the notebook will be compiled, the pipeline will be uploaded, and then we'll be in a running state of the pipeline. So let's go ahead and view the pipeline as it's running. And you can see we've already done our first step here, which is that we've already created our volume. Now we've moved into the load data step. Now that the load data step has completed, we're ready to start pre-processing our data. With the pre-processing data step completed, we now advance to the model training step. And with that final step complete, you have now successfully run the Open Model Vaccine as a pipeline.